Pursue them. Make sure they do not escape. Yes, sir. We are right behind them. Let us wait here. They will walk straight into our trap. Welcome to History of Forgotten Souls, where lost stories rise again. If you have not subscribed yet, please kindly do so you do not miss any of our stories. Tell us where you are watching from, your city, your country, and what time it is there. If you have not already, make sure to subscribe and like our channel so you never miss stories like this. It was a humid early morning in the deep swamps of Louisiana, the kind of place where the air itself seemed heavy on your chest, where fog clung to the trees like ghosts that refused to leave. Birds had begun their calls, loud and sharp, yet the forest seemed otherwise quiet. Two brothers, Jeremiah and Malachi Johnson, had been awake since before the first light pushed through the thick canopy. Their skin was wet with dew, their clothes damp from sleeping on the muddy banks of the swamp, but neither of them complained. Today would not be a day for rest. It would be a day for survival. For weeks, they had been chased by 13 men, armed with rifles, knives, and a hatred born from jealousy and fear. The Johnson brothers were known among the nearby plantations for their defiance. They had once been enslaved, but unlike many others, they had escaped into the swamp and refused to be taken again. Over time, the hunters had grown obsessed. 13 men now followed their trail, believing that capturing the brothers would restore their pride and send a warning to anyone else who dared challenge the system. The brothers knew better. They had learned the swamp in a way their pursuers could never truly understand. Every cypress root, every hidden water path, every sinking patch of mud was a weapon in disguise. As Jeremiah scanned the distance, he whispered to Malachi, "The men are close. I can hear their dogs." Malachi nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing. "Today the swamp will fight beside us, brother." They did not move fast, but they moved wisely, weaving through channels and shallow waters, covering their tracks and hiding their scent with mud and broken reeds. Every step was careful, every leaf bent quietly beneath their weight. They knew that if the hunters caught them on open ground, there would be no mercy. The 13 men had come prepared for blood. As the sun climbed higher, mist rolled across the water, hiding them from sight. Jeremiah suddenly stopped and lifted his hand. "Do you hear that?" Malachi tilted his head. At first there was nothing, then the faint bark of a hound. Closer now. Not one, not two, but 3 voices echoing through the swamp. The brothers exchanged a look. This was the moment the hunt would turn deadly, but not in the way the hunters expected. Jeremiah bent down and pulled a long, thin branch from the water. Malachi did the same. These were not weapons in the usual sense. They were tools of cleverness. The hunter's advantage was in firepower, and in the belief that the brothers could not survive the swamp. But arrogance often blinds men to danger. The brothers began moving toward a stretch of swamp that looked shallow, but Jeremiah knew the truth. The area was filled with hidden holes, soft mud, and deep pockets of water ready to swallow the careless. As they moved through the water, they left behind faint marks that looked like animal tracks. The swamp itself seemed to whisper in agreement, bending reeds and branches as if guiding them. Meanwhile, the hunters moved across higher ground. Believing themselves safe, their horses stomped loudly, their boots sank into the mud, and their eyes searched for signs. They followed what they believed were tracks, never realizing the small marks were carefully placed deceptions. One hunter, a tall man named Samuel Price, raised his hand and signaled the others to stop. "I think they went this way," he said, pointing toward what appeared to be a dry piece of land. The brothers watched quietly from a distance, their faces covered with mud, water dripping from their hair. Malachi whispered softly, "Let them come," and they did. The first hunter rode into the hidden mud pit. The ground that looked solid gave way beneath the horse's hooves. It sank with a deep, sucking sound. The rider cursed and tried to pull the horse free, but the more he struggled, the deeper they sank. Behind him, the others rushed forward, thinking they could reach the brothers before trouble began. But the swamp had already taken its first victory. A second hunter jumped down to help, and soon 3 of the men were floundering in the mud, rifles and boots covered in thick black sludge. The brothers moved silently ahead, slipping through water channels too narrow for the hunters' horses to follow. They used small sticks to create fake disturbances, leading the remaining hunters into more traps. One by one, the men became stuck, some up to their waists, others struggling to keep their rifles above the water, as panic replaced their confidence. By midday, the hunters were exhausted. Mud had slowed their horses almost to a stop. Their shouts echoed across the swamp, yet the Johnson brothers remained out of sight, their plan unfolding like a patient predator. They had not fired a single shot. They had not shown their position. Instead, they had turned the swamp itself into a weapon. Around them, the cypress trees and thick brush stood like silent witnesses. A pair of hawks circled high above, their cries covering the small movements below. Then the brothers made their final move. A narrow waterway led into a deeper part of the swamp, water almost waist-high, but funneling into a series of soft mud traps. Jeremiah made a small gesture. Malachi understood at once. They would guide the remaining hunters here, and the swamp would finish the job. One by one, the hunters followed, unaware of the danger hidden beneath the dark water. Their boots sank. Their rifles slipped from their hands, now slick with mud. Panic broke out as some men fell into hidden pockets, arms flailing as they fought for air. 3 men shouted in fear when their horses sank partly beside them, the chaos growing louder with every moment. At the far edge, the brothers waited quietly, moving only when needed to redirect a rider deeper into the trap. Sweat ran down their faces, but they remained calm, their plan unfolding like a lesson in survival. By late afternoon, only a few hunters remained standing on firm ground. Some had been injured, others had retreated toward higher land, humiliated and defeated. Jeremiah finally breathed out slowly, the tightness in his body easing. Malachi placed a hand on his shoulder. They had survived, yes, but the swamp had done more than protect them. It had become a weapon of justice, turning the arrogance of men against themselves. That night, the brothers lit a small fire inside a hollow log and dried their clothes. They thought about what had happened. They had faced 13 hunters, each armed and dangerous, yet they had used knowledge, patience, and the land itself to change the outcome. Jeremiah muttered quietly under his breath, "Eliza, wait, no wrong memory." But the lesson remained clear. Survival depended on cleverness, not only courage. They would not rest long. Word would spread, and others would come searching. But for that moment, the swamp belonged to them, a living shield, a silent partner that had proven far more deadly than rifles or hatred. In the darkness, as frogs croaked and night insects hummed their steady rhythm, the Johnson brothers knew one truth above all: those who underestimate the land, and those who ignore the knowledge born from struggle, do so at their own danger. The swamp had spoken, and 13 men had learned that lesson through their pride and their pain. Night covered the swamp like a dark breathing blanket. Jeremiah and Malak, high, crouched beneath the roots of an ancient cypress tree, its twisted bark above them like the crooked fingers of some forgotten spirit. Water lapped gently at the edges of the shallow hollow they had chosen as a hiding place, and the wind carried a wet, earthy smell that clung to their skin. Every sound seemed louder in the darkness. Frogs croaked with strange urgency. A heron cried once, and then fell silent, as if it too was holding its breath. Jeremiah pressed his hand against the damp ground, feeling the faint vibrations beneath his fingers. Every footstep, every horse hoof from the hunters could be felt traveling through the mud and water like a secret signal. Malachi did the same. The swamp had become their eyes and ears. They spoke only when needed. Any careless word could alert the men still chasing them, the 13 who had sworn to capture them. The first mistake the hunters had made was arrogance. They believed brute strength and rifles could overcome what they did not understand. They did not know the swamp, and they did not respect it. The swamp, patient and silent, had taught them its lesson quickly. As the darkness deepened, the hunters began gathering again. Their voices carried through the trees, loud and angry. Samuel Price cursed again and again, while dragging his horse from one sticky mud pit to another. One man had even lost a boot completely to the grip of the swamp. Their frustration grew, but the swamp offered no kindness. The brothers listened, their hearts steady despite the danger, knowing that every shout and curse was a sign of fear. The land itself had become their weapon. Jeremiah leaned close to Malachi and whispered, "We need to move now." The brothers rose slowly, testing the water with careful steps. They avoided the same mud traps that had captured their enemies, moving along hidden routes and submerged logs that gave firm footing was simple but dangerous. Their plan was simple but dangerous. They would lead the hunters deeper into territory only they understood, where hidden quicksand like mud pockets and narrow waterways could separate the men from their weapons. They moved quietly, their feet barely disturbing the water. Behind them, the hunters' shouts grew louder, showing that they were pushing forward, chasing shadows. The brothers paused near a narrow channel almost hidden beneath low-hanging branches, and thick vines. Jeremiah murmured softly, "This is the place. When the hunters reach here, it will be their downfall." They stayed low and still as the first of the riders entered the narrow channel. The ground looked solid at first, but it suddenly collapsed under both horse and rider. The man shouted in terror, his pistol and rifle sliding into the dark water as he struggled wildly. One after another, the hunters followed into the same stretch, and the swamp swallowed them without pity. Some sank to their waists, others almost to their chests. Horses fought against the pulling mud and water, their hooves trapped by the sucking ground. Panic moved faster than reason. The brothers watched quietly from their hiding place, fully aware of the strength of patience and careful planning. Years of hard labor under systems meant to control them had taught them that brute force alone was never enough. That truth repeated itself in the cries and splashes behind them. By midnight, only a few hunters remained standing on slightly higher ground. They were no longer organized. They shouted confused orders at each other, rifles shaking in their hands, fingers slippery with mud, their earlier arrogance now replaced with fear. Jeremiah and Malachi used the fog and the trees to move around quietly, placing themselves where they could stop anyone who tried to escape. They stepped slowly and silently, making sure no movement betrayed their presence. When one hunter attempted to circle around, believing he had discovered a safe path, he stepped into a hidden dip, filled with dark water and tangled roots. He shouted as he struggled, his rifle slipping away into the swamp beside him. The brothers remained still, allowing the swamp to do exactly what it always did. At times, Malachi quietly gave directions to Jeremiah, telling him which branch to snap or which patch of mud to disturb, gently steering the hunters toward traps they could not see. Every wrong step had been expected, every frightened reaction imagined before it happened. By the early morning hours, the swamp had finished most of its work. 7 men were stuck in thick mud, soaked, tired, and terrified. 2 had climbed to higher ground, bleeding from cuts and snake bites, hidden in the dark water. 4 had lost their horses completely. The brothers stayed hidden and silent, observing the full result of their thinking and the swamp's strength. Hunger and fatigue gnawed at their bodies, but rest was not possible yet. They had to make sure no hunter escaped to gather reinforcements. They waited for daylight to thin the fog. Sunlight could reveal their location if they stayed too long. As the first weak rays of morning light pushed through the heavy canopy, sending pale streaks across the swamp, the brothers began their last movement. They needed to leave this place quickly before the hunters could reorganize and send for more men. The narrow waterway ahead led to a chain of small lagoons, each deeper and more dangerous than the one before it. Jeremiah and Malachi stepped forward first, testing every patch of ground. They placed branches carefully in certain spots to confuse the hunters and create false trails. Then they waited again. Soon the hunters would discover the missing path and assume the brothers had run south or toward open La, and that assumption would be their mistake. The brothers guided them instead toward the lagoons. Some hunters followed carefully, Others, driven by anger and desperation, rushed blindly into the water, becoming trapped or separated from their weapons. One hunter shouted loudly when his horse suddenly slipped beneath the surface, disappearing into mud and dark water. The fear spread quickly among the group. By mid-morning, the swamp had captured nearly all 13 men, leaving only a few standing on dry patches of higher ground. Too frightened to move forward and too stubborn to retreat, they hesitated. The brothers wasted no time. Using sticks, branches, and wet mud, they carefully covered their tracks, removing any sign that they had passed through. They moved quickly toward another waterway, a thin stream twisting through thick brush. It would allow them to travel faster than any hunters who still followed. As they moved through the stream, Malachi whispered quietly, "The swamp is our weapon, but we are its blade." Every lesson from their childhood, every narrow escape, every moment spent surviving had led them to this point. They continued forward without turning back, knowing the hunters would never dare follow them through such a narrow and winding water path. The swamp had already done its duty. The hunters had underestimated both the land and the two brothers who understood it better than anyone. By late morning they reached a stretch of higher ground, soaked but alive, unbroken and free. They paused, briefly, letting the sunlight warm their wet clothes and cold skin. Around them the swamp seemed calm again, almost satisfied. They had survived not through violence alone, but through wisdom, patience, and deep knowledge of the swamp's hidden paths. Hunger, exhaustion, and the cold night air still clung to them. Yet for the first time in many weeks they felt a quick, yet sense of victory. They had faced 13 hunters who came seeking blood, but the swamp had been the true weapon, and they had served as its guides. The day had proven the truth the hunters would never accept. Those who understand the land possess power far beyond rifles or knives. As Jeremiah and Malachi rested for a short moment beside the muddy banks, they understood something clearly. The swamp was no longer just a hiding place. It had become a living ally, a shield that would protect them as long as they respected its rules. Every step they had taken, every choice, every careful risk, had mattered. By afternoon, the brothers were already discussing their next plans. The hunters would not give up easily. They would recover their strength, gather more men, and try again. But now the Johnson brothers had shown something greater than simple survival. They had proven that intelligence, patience, and knowledge could turn even the most dangerous pursuit into an advantage. They traveled deeper into the swamp, along paths known only to them, leaving behind confusion, fear, and wounded pride. Above the swamp, the sun filtered through mist and tall cypress branches, lighting two figures who had turned hunters into the hunted, who had shaped nature itself into a weapon, and who would continue their journey until freedom, safety, and justice belonged to them alone. The swamp grew quieter as the Johnson brothers pushed farther into its winding waterways. Thick fog hovered over the water, curling around cypress roots like pale, ghostly fingers, hiding every movement from any watchful eyes. Jeremiah and Malachi stayed silent. Their breathing was steady, their footsteps careful. Every curve of water and every hidden pocket of mud had been memorized over years. The swamp had become more than shelter. It was a living partner, teaching them patience and careful thinking. Behind them, too, 13 hunters who had sworn to capture or kill them were slowly regrouping. Those who survived the first disastrous night had learned caution. They spoke in quiet voices, cursing both the swamp and the brothers with equal anger. Samuel Price had been shamed in the mud, his horse gone, his pride shattered. Still, he refused to quit. He gathered the remaining men and spoke through clenched teeth. "We find them, no matter what it costs." They began forming another plan, born from frustration and greed. The rivers and mud had slowed them, but they believed the brothers must be weakened by hunger and exhaustion. They failed to understand the knowledge of two men, raised in the very land they were hunting through. Jeremiah crouched beside Malachi as they listened to the distant voices drifting across the swamp. The hunters were close enough that their curses and commands could be heard, yet still far enough away for the brothers to remain hidden. Their eyes met quietly. "They will come," Malachi whispered. "And when they do, they will fall again." Jeremiah nodded slowly. "The swamp is patient. So are we." Over the next few hours, the brothers traveled through a narrow maze of waterways, shallow pools, and fallen logs. Every few minutes they stopped to listen and observe. The fog made distance difficult to judge, but sound carried strangely across water. A snapping twig, or a boot, sinking into mud, could reveal more than a rifle shot ever could. Around midday, the hunters tried splitting their forces. Some moved around the eastern edge of the swamp, hoping to trap the brothers between two groups. Others attempted a direct path, using the higher banks to search for movement. It was exactly what the Johnson brothers had expected, Jeremiah whispered softly, and together they moved silently to prepare another trap. At a hidden bend in the waterway, the channel narrowed to barely the width of a man. Thick mud lay beneath the water, nearly waist deep, with twisted tree roots, waiting to grab any careless step. Jeremiah and Malachi positioned themselves along the banks, hidden in fog and shadow, waiting for the first hunter to appear. Moments later, a boot stepped through the mist. The man paused, scanning the water, thinking he had seen something move. He stepped forward. The mud swallowed him instantly. His rifle splashed into the water. He shouted loudly, struggling, and the noise drew the others closer. The brothers waited. One by one, the hunters stumbled into the trap. Panic quickly replaced discipline. Angry curses spread across the swamp as men became tangled in roots, sucked into mud, or forced to abandon their weapons. Horses refused to enter the narrow path, sensing danger. The swamp worked silently and steadily. Jeremiah and Malachi moved only when necessary, guiding the hunters deeper into danger with small signs such as broken branches and shifted logs. No gunshots rang out, no knives were used. The swamp itself carried out the capture. By late afternoon, only a few men remained standing on higher ground, soaked, exhausted, and discouraged. The rest had been trapped, shamed, or pushed into retreat. The brothers slipped quietly along another narrow waterway, leaving the hunters scattered and confused. For a brief moment, the sun broke through the fog, casting pale golden light across the dark water. The brothers stopped to breathe, aware they had survived another confrontation, yet understanding the hunters would continue their pursuit. They were patient. Yes, but so were the Johnson brothers. Hunger pulled at them, but they ignored it, focusing on movement, position, and the constant advantage given by the swamp itself. Around a sharp bend in the waterway, Jeremiah noticed a small opening ahead. Channel, leading toward a hollow where the water grew deeper, forming a natural pit. This place could be used to catch the remaining men completely. He signaled quietly to Malachi. Slowly, they placed thin branches and mud along the edges, making the pit look shallow, almost safe, inviting an easy step for any pursuer who rushed forward. Then they waited. Within an hour, the first of the remaining hunters stepped into the hollow, believing he had finally cornered his target. The mud swallowed his leg, then slowly took the other. He shouted loudly as he struggled, but the pit held him firmly. Another hunter rushed in to help, and soon both men were stuck. Their cries were angry and desperate, but no one came to rescue them. The brothers stayed hidden. Above them, the cypress trees stood silent, their roots twisted like fingers, ready to close around the careless. As evening moved closer, the Johnsons walked quietly along the bank unseen, careful not to leave tracks that might reveal where they had gone. They stopped at a narrow passage where the swamp narrowed into a channel too tight for a man and horse to pass together. Here the brothers finally rested for a short moment. Malachi pulled a small piece of dried meat from his pack and handed it to Jeremiah. They ate slowly and quietly, saving their strength for whatever might happen next. Every sound in the swamp seemed louder than usual. Frogs croaked, insects hummed. Somewhere far away, branches snapped under unseen pressure. But the brothers understood the meaning of these sounds. The hunters were still moving, or perhaps other dangers were wandering in the shadows of the swamp. Jeremiah raised a finger to his lips and whispered, "Do you hear that?" Malachi tilted his head slightly. A gentle splash came from the mist. It was too careful to be made by an animal. They were not alone. From the fog, a small group of hunters, who had separated earlier, slowly appear, Ed stepping carefully through the shallow water. Their rifles were raised, but their movements were cautious. Jeremiah and Malachi exchanged a quiet glance. Now it was becoming personal. Slowly they guided the hunters toward another hidden trap, using branches and patches of mud to lead them down false paths. Panic began almost immediately. One hunter slipped into mud that reached his waist. Another stumbled into a shallow pool, hidden by fog and reeds. The swamp worked with quiet accuracy, claiming the pride of men who believed they ruled the land. By midnight, the remaining hunters were scattered, tired, and discouraged. The brothers slipped quietly through a final passage and stepped onto slightly higher ground. Behind them, the swamp became calm again, almost respectful. They had survived another attack, using patience, intelligence, and the living land itself as their weapon. Hunger, wet clothing, and exhaustion weighed heavily on them, yet a small feeling of victory remained in their hearts. They had faced 13 hunters, armed and determined, and had turned every advantage those men carried against them. The swamp had done its work, and the Johnson brothers had guided it perfectly. When dawn arrived, pale light filtered through the mist, and they paused to study the land around them. Beyond the trees lay a stretch of forest that could lead them to a small river and eventually to safety. But they also knew the hunters would regroup. They might return with reinforcements. They might attempt new strategies. The Johnson brothers understood this clearly. The swamp was a weapon, but clever thinking, bravery, and patience were always needed to use it well. They had survived the first wave, and they would survive the next one as well, using the swamp as both shield and blade. And with every careful step through the mist, they carried not only hope for freedom but so a lesson for anyone who believed the land itself could not fight back. The swamp had grown quiet again, but the tension never truly left the Johnson brothers. Jeremiah and Malachi continued forward, carefully, knowing that 13 men with rifles, knives, and stubborn hatred would not give up easily. Each step through the moss-covered cypress trees was measured. Every sound of a snapping twig or splashing water was studied closely. They could almost feel the swamp beneath their feet, as if it were alive, guiding them, warning them, shaping their route. They stopped beside a narrow creek, where the water was dark and thick with sediment. The channel itself was shallow, but its banks were crowded with tangled roots and hidden branches beneath the surface. It was the perfect place to prepare another trap. Jeremiah crouched down and snapped off a branch, dropping it gently into the water. Malachi did the same, hiding each small disturbance carefully. The hunters, believing they had tracked the brothers correctly, would see only faint movement and signs, never realizing it had been placed there intentionally. Hours passed slowly. The sun climbed higher, and its light filtered through the fog and leaves, turning the swamp into a pale and ghost-like world. The brothers moved carefully, saving their energy because rushing would only lead to mistakes. From far away they heard faint shouting. The hunters were still alive, still organized enough to gather together again, and still foolish enough to keep following. Every shout gave the brothers another opportunity, and every shout gave the brothers another opportunity. Every mistake made by the hunters became another weapon. By midday, the first hunter stepped down from higher ground into the waterway. He believed the ground was solid. It was not. He sank to his knees instantly, his rifle slipping from his hands and falling into the mud beside him. He shouted in fear while the brought, hers, remained hidden, watching closely. Another hunter stepped forward to pull him free and immediately became trapped as well. Mud rose to their waists, gripping tightly and forcing them to fight against the swamp's unbreakable hold. Their cries echoed through the trees, sharp and desperate in the heavy air. Jeremiah and Malachi moved quietly along submerged logs and narrow edges where the mud could not reach them. They slowly guided the hunters deeper into the trap, breaking small branches and shifting reeds, just enough to suggest safe paths ahead. One hunter named Samuel Price cursed loudly as his horse became stuck in a soft patch of mud. Unable to free the animal, he abandoned it and tried to reach solid ground, only to sink deeper into mud hidden beneath fallen leaves. The brothers watched with cold patience. In this swamp there was no mercy, only survival, planning, and the consequences of poor judgment. The hunters slowly began to understand that they had been tricked. Fear spread among them. Their order collapsed, and their pride weakened. Some attempted to retreat toward higher land, but the swamp had already closed the easiest paths. Jeremiah whispered softly and guided Melaki toward a side channel that led near a small lagoon, where hidden mud pockets waited silently. The hunters, angry and desperate, stepped into deeper water, losing their balance, dropping rifles into the dark depths. Their frustration grew. Voices rose. Commands were shouted, but there was no longer any real order among them. The swamp swallowed their confidence, just as it swallowed their footing. By late afternoon, only a few hunters remained standing on firm ground. They were tired, soaked, embarrassed, and frightened. Many horses had been lost or abandoned. Rifles were damaged. Their unity had disappeared. The Johnson brothers moved carefully along secret paths and water channels, circling quietly so they could observe without being seen. Every step was planned, every movement controlled. They had become part of the swamp itself. Night slowly returned, and the brothers found a hollow beneath a leaning cypress tree. They settled there in silence, listening carefully. The hunters were still searching, but without coordination. The swamp had turned their chase into confusion. Jeremiah broke another small piece of dried meat from his pack and passed it to Malachi. They ate slowly, preserving their strength. Hunger remained, but it was a small price for survival. Every lesson learned during childhood, every close escape, every day spent traveling the secret paths of the swamp had prepared them for this moment. They understood their environment completely, and the hunters, despite their weapons and numbers, had fallen victim to ignorance and pride. As darkness deepened, the Johnson brothers moved again. In the distance they heard scattered sounds, shouts, splashes, and the clinking noise of abandoned rifles and boots. It sounded like defeat, echoing through the swamp. Still, they understood the pursuit would not end here. The hunters would regroup. They would return with more men, stronger weapons, and renewed determination. But the swamp had already given them a lesson that would be hard to forget. Patience, knowledge of the land, and careful planning were stronger than any rifle or knife. The brothers moved through narrow channels, avoiding shallow areas and hidden mud traps they themselves had created earlier. They walked silently, leaving no evidence behind. Branches were placed back, exactly as they had been. Mud was smoothed carefully. The swamp seemed to breathe around them, alive, protective, and patient. By midnight, they reached a slightly higher patch of land, a small clearing where they could rest briefly without fear of being seen. They had survived another stage of the hunt, turning the hunters' pride into their downfall and using the swamp as both protection and weapon. Malachi crouched beside Jeremiah and watched the dark water carefully. They had food for the night, water to drink, but more importantly, they had learned the weaknesses of their enemies: desperation, impatience, and the dangerous habit of underestimating others. It was a lesson that could be used again if needed. The swamp was patient, but now the brothers had become even more patient. They could predict the hunters' movements. They could imagine the routes they would choose. The land itself had become a map filled with opportunities. As dawn slowly approached, the Johnson brothers prepared for the next stage. They would not run blindly. Instead, they would guide the hunters again into confusion, traps, and humiliation. Every step would be thoughtful, every decision planned. Survival had always depended on intelligence, and they possessed that in great measure. The swamp would fight beside them, but the brothers had become its blade, its voice, its master. When the first light of morning spread across the water, the hunters who remained were still searching. Some had withdrawn for a time, nursing injuries, wet clothing, and wounded pride. Others, more reckless, continued forward, unaware that the swamp now watched them through the eyes of two brothers who understood every hidden path, every dangerous patch of ground, and every secret waterway. And as the fog slowly lifted over the swamp, Jeremiah and Malachi allowed themselves a faint smile. They were not simply running anymore. They were preparing the final lesson, a clear demonstration that the swamp, when used wisely, could be more deadly than gnaw, and any man holding a rifle, more powerful than any plan created in arrogance, and that no level of hatred could defeat knowledge combined with patience. The swamp had turned into their weapon. The hunters had turned into prey, and the struggle for survival had only just started. The swamp rested in an uneasy silence as the first light of dawn slowly pushed through the mist. Jeremiah and Malachi had not rested for long. Every instinct warned them that the hunters, embarrassed but not beaten, would come back with stronger determination. They understood that the swamp had given them an advantage earlier, but too much confidence could be dangerous. Survival demanded watchfulness, patience, and clever demanded watchfulness, patience, and clever thinking beyond anything their pursuers could imagine. The brothers moved carefully along a narrow water path, the dark water thick and nearly waist-deep in several places. Each step was planned. Every branch and path carefully tested it before they trusted it. The mud under their feet squished and shifted, ready to trap anyone unfamiliar with its hidden depths. The swamp was patient, yes, but it required deep understanding to use it as a weapon, and the Johnson brothers carried that understanding in abundance. They had not yet heard the hunters, but they did not need to hear them. The wind carried faint scents, gun oil, sweat, and the sharp smell of horses that had struggled through the sticky mud. These were clear signs of men chasing them, and Jeremiah silently pointed toward Malachi. They began moving faster now, gliding quietly through the narrow water channels that only they truly understood. Every twist and curve of the creek was known to them. It was a path they had traveled since childhood, remembered and perfected through countless moments of escape and survival. Several hours passed in tense quiet. Now and then they heard the distant clatter of a boot or the bark of a hunting dog, but the fog and thick swamp twisted the sounds, making it difficult to locate their source. The hunters were getting closer, but they did not know the exact location of the brothers. That was exactly what Jeremiah and Malachi wanted. By late morning, Jeremiah discovered a suitable location, a wide stretch of shallow water surrounded by thick cypress roots, sunken logs, and hidden mud pits. This place would become their trap, their last line of protection, their moment of control. He gestured quietly to Malachi. Together they began preparing carefully, shifting mud to form hidden pockets, snapping branches to look like disturbed footprints, and arranging reeds to guide the hunters unknowingly toward danger. Every movement was subtle, careful, and precise. From distant higher ground, the hunters finally appeared through the fog. 13 men had once chased them, but now only 8 remained. They were soaked, tired, angry, and desperate. Their pride had been damaged, their numbers reduced, and still they continued forward, believing that brute strength alone could defeat something they did not fully understand. The first hunter stepped cautiously into the shallow water. He believed the ground beneath was solid. It was not. His boots sank into hidden mud pockets, pulling him downward with sudden force. He stumbled, waved his arms, and cursed loudly. The others rushed to help him, only to discover their own boots sinking the same way. Panic spread quickly. Shouting, yelling, and frantic movement replaced strategy and discipline. The swamp claimed them slowly and carefully, each man falling victim to his own pride. Jeremiah and Malachi watched silently, fully understanding the power of patience. Not a single rifle had been fired. No knife had been fired. No knife had been drawn. Yet, the hunters were already losing the battle. The swamp itself had become their weapon, turning the hunters' strength into weakness and their confidence into fear. Hours slowly passed. The hunters struggled through waist-deep mud, while others fought desperately to keep their rifles above the dirty water. Their voices echoed through the trees, But the brothers remained hidden. Every move the hunters made only pushed them deeper into disaster. One hunter, Samuel Price, shouted in anger while trying to reach solid ground, only to sink deeper into the sticky mud. His rifle slipped from his hands and disappeared quietly beneath the dark water. By mid-afternoon, the hunters were exhausted. Their coordination was gone, their weapons were lost, and some had even abandoned their horses entirely. The swamp had embarrassed them again and again, yet they still had not learned the lesson. Desperation pushed them toward reckless choices. Malachi whispered quietly to Jeremiah, "Now is the moment." Slowly, they began moving, guiding the remaining hunters toward a narrow passage where the water became deeper. The mud turned thicker and more dangerous, and hidden roots waited to trip anyone who did not know the ground well. The hunters followed without thinking, eager to finish the chase, eager to capture the brothers, eager to prove themselves after such humiliation. One after another, they fell into hidden pits, their boots trapped, rifles lost, and their cries swallowed by the swamp. The brothers observed quietly and patiently, guiding the hunters like puppets toward their final trap. By evening, only 2 hunters remained standing on slightly higher ground. They were soaked, shaking with cold, terrified, and completely exhausted. The swamp had taken everything else. The horses were gone. Their pride was gone. Their equipment had vanished. And still the 2 men stood there trembling, unsure what they should do next. Jeremiah and Malachi knew that a final confrontation could not be avoided. These last men would either run away or attempt one desperate attack. They had to be careful. One mistake could change everything. Every instinct sharpened within them. Every sense focused on the swamp, the hunters, and the small changes in air and water. The brothers moved closer, using submerged logs and narrow strips of land to approach without showing themselves. The mist hung thick in the air, hiding their movements completely. Suddenly, the first hunter stepped forward, believing he had seen movement in the fog. Jeremiah and Malachi burst from their cover at the same moment, shouting loudly and holding sharpened sticks like spears. The hunters froze in fear, finally realizing that the swamp itself had become their enemy. One man screamed and stumbled backwards straight into a deep mud pit, his arms flailing wildly as his rifle disappeared beneath the water. The other hunter, frozen with terror, slowly dropped to his knees. The swamp had trapped them completely. Jeremiah stepped forward firmly. "Do not move. Do not move," he commanded. The hunter's eyes widened with fear. The brothers moved closer, their presence strong and silent, while the swamp seemed to rise behind them like a hidden army. The hunter tried to run, but the mud and water captured him immediately. He shouted and struggled wildly, realizing too late that the swamp was not simply land, but a weapon controlled by those who understood its secrets. By nightfall, the swamp was quiet once again. The Johnson brothers stood alone on a small patch of higher ground, soaked and exhausted, but victorious. 13 hunters had come searching for them, 13 men armed with rifles and knives. Yet not one had succeeded. The swamp had become the weapon, but the brothers had been the guiding force, the mind and hand directing its deadly precision. They allowed themselves only a short moment to rest. Hunger pressed heavily against them, and exhaustion pulled at their bodies, but a feeling of victory filled their hearts. They had faced death, humiliation, and relentless pursuit, yet they had survived. The swamp had been their ally, their shield, and their sword. It had protected them, punished arrogance, and proven that knowledge of the land could turn the strongest weapons into useless metal. Jeremiah looked toward Malachi, his eyes still sharp despite the fatigue. "This is not finished," he said quietly. "Others will come, they always do, but now we know the swamp fights beside us. Not just for us. We move at dawn. We stay ahead at all times. The lessons we learn today will guide us through every danger ahead." The lessons we learn today will guide us through every danger ahead. Frogs croaked in the darkness. Insects hummed steadily, and water shifted gently as if recognizing their mastery. The battle was over for the moment, but survival always demanded awareness. The Joe Shanson brothers had turned the hunters into prey, yet the swamp reminded them that every advantage required respect, patience, and constant alertness. Night settled completely, and the brothers drifted into a short, careful sleep. The swamp surrounded them, alive and breathing slowly. Every sound carried a warning. Every shadow carried a lesson. They knew the hunters might gather again, bring reinforcements, or try new strategies. But Jeremiah and Malachi were prepared. The swamp had revealed its secrets to them, and they had learned them well. No man could defeat that combination of knowledge, patience, and terrain. At the first light of dawn, they would continue deeper into safety, using every hidden water path, every mud trap, and every cypress trail as a weapon against anyone brave enough to follow. 13 men had chased them into the swamp to kill them, and 13 men had fallen into the trap they never understood. The swamp was alive, patient, and deadly, and Jeremiah and Malachi Johnson had become its masters. The swamp rested in heavy silence as the first sunlight slowly passed through the fog, turning the water into a dull gray-green. Jeremiah and Malachi Johnson had survived many close encounters. 13 hunters had come seeking their lives with traps, rifles, and arrogance. Now, only a few scattered remains of that original group were left. The brothers understood they could not afford even a moment of carelessness. Every sound, every motion, every small ripple in the water carried meaning. They moved slowly and quietly, staying low, while using submerged logs and hidden channels to hide their presence. The swamp had already been their shield and weapon, but careful attention was still necessary. One wrong step could mean death. They listened closely, as distant voices floated weakly through the fog. The hunters, ashamed and desperate, were trying to gather themselves again. They had lost horses, rifles, pride, and confidence, but stubborn fear pushed them forward. Nothing would stop them from attempting to capture the brothers. Jeremiah raised a finger to his lips. "We do not let them know we are here yet," he whispered softly. Malachi nodded. Patience is the key. They knew the hunters' arrogance and desperation would eventually make them careless, and they planned to use that weakness to their advantage one final time. Hours passed while the brothers worked quietly through the swamp, creating false trails and bending reeds in careful patterns to suggest movement in one direction, while they secretly moved another way. Every branch bent, every sign placed carefully, guiding the hunters deeper into confusion. Every mud pocket placed carefully was part of a plan leading the hunters without showing their position. The swamp itself felt alive, shaping the path, listening and reacting. By midday, the hunters reached a wide channel, thinking they had finally outsmarted the brothers. They believed the ground ahead was firm, the water shallow and safe. It was not. Jeremiah and Malachi had spent the morning preparing this last trap, a wide stretch of water filled with hidden mud pockets, sunken roots, and narrow channels that could separate men from their weapons and from one another. The first hunter stepped into the water and quickly sank to his knees. His rifle slipped from his hands and vanished into the dark water. The others rushed forward to help him, only to discover they were trapped as well. Panic spread immediately, a wave of confusion that made teamwork impossible. The brothers watched quietly, guiding the hunters gently with moved branches and broken reeds. One hunter, Samuel Price, tried to climb a small bank, but the mud dragged him backward and he fell face first into the water. Another rushed to reach him, only to sink up to his waist. The swamp had turned into a living trap, harsh and exact, punishing arrogance and lack of experience with perfect timing. By late afternoon, the remaining hunters were scattered, their rifles lost or useless, their horses gone, their pride destroyed. Some tried to run, but every direction led to more traps, more mud, and more confusion. The swamp had changed from a place of shelter into a weapon, a living force that punished arrogance and rewarded patience. Jeremiah and Malachi moved along a hidden water path deeper into the swamp. Every step was slow and careful, making sure no trace was left behind. The hunters, desperate and angry, could not follow. Their movement was slow, awkward, and easy to predict. The brothers had turned the swamp itself into a maze of their own design. Night fell, and the shadows of the swamp grew darker. The brothers paused beneath the branches of a huge cypress tree, listening. The hunters had stopped for the night, pulling back to higher ground to avoid more disaster. Jeremiah whispered, "Tomorrow the swamp will decide who remains." Malachi nodded. "We prepare more traps, we guide them again, and we make sure no one follows us." They spent the night shifting mud pockets, placing fallen logs to form narrow passages, and creating false trails that would confuse any pursuer. Every action was careful, intentional, and unseen. The swamp had become their partner, alert and watchful, and they used it like a weapon with patience and skill. By dawn they were ready. The hunters appeared again, only a few now, nervous, desperate, and exhausted. They believed strength could defeat nature. They believed they could still capture the brothers. They were wrong. Jeremiah and Malachi guided them slowly, letting the hunters think they were following an easy trail. But the swamp had other intentions. One by one, the hunters fell into hidden mud traps, submerged roots twisting around their legs, water swallowing their boots and rifles. Panic spread. Orders were shouted. Voices cracked. Orders were shouted. Voices cracked. Cooperation vanished. The swamp claimed them with precision. It was a trap born from patience, intelligence, and deep knowledge of the land. By midday, only one hunter remained, shaking, soaked, exhausted, and terrified. The brothers had made sure he would witness the swamp's power himself. Jeremiah stepped from cover. "Do not move," he ordered. The hunter froze. Malachi stepped out beside him, the two brothers forming a silent wall of authority. The swamp itself seemed to rise behind them, shadows shifting, roots hidden beneath water, mud ready to claim another victim. The hunter's eyes widened in fear, realizing too late that the swamp, guided by those who knew it, could not be defeated. He slipped slightly backward into the mud, a final warning from the swamp itself. Jeremiah and Malachi moved forward slowly, keeping control without needless violence. The hunter, shaking, dropped his useless rifle. He had learned a harsh lesson about arrogance and the strength of nature. The brothers did not strike. The swamp had already done the work. Survival was theirs. Victory was won not through violence, but through strategy, patience, and understanding. By late afternoon, Jeremiah and Malachi reached higher ground, wet, exhausted, but victorious. The swamp had protected them, punished the proud, and turned the protected them, punished the pursuit into their defeat. They allowed themselves a short moment of relief, knowing they had survived the impossible. 13 men had come to kill them, and the swamp had ensured they would leave empty-handed, broken, and humiliated. As the sun went down, the brothers rested for a moment among the cypress roots. Their bodies ached from wet clothes, mud, and constant tension, but their spirits were high. They had turned the hunters into prey, used the swamp as a weapon, and survived through intelligence, patience, and courage. Jeremiah spoke quietly. "We survived, yes, but we must never forget. Others may come." Malachi nodded. "The swamp will always fight with us if we respect it. It is more than land. It is a weapon, a protector, and a lesson." The Johnson brothers had mastered it, and the swamp rewarded them with survival, freedom, and wisdom. As darkness fully settled, the swamp whispered around them. Frogs croaked, insects hummed, water moved softly. The Johnson brothers knew they were safe for now, but the lesson would last forever. Knowledge of the land, patience, strategy, and respect for its power could defeat even the strongest and most determined enemies. 13 hunters had learned this too late. The swamp had spoken. The Johnson brothers had listened, and in the shadows of the cypress trees they rested in victory, knowing that survival belonged not to the strongest, not to the most heavily armed, but to those who understood the land, its secrets, and its power. Tomorrow they would move again, deeper into safety, always ahead, always patient, always clever, The hunters would never truly understand what had defeated them. The swamp would remain their ally, their weapon, and their shield. And the Johnson brothers, soaked, tired, and triumphant, would continue their journey, masters of the land and of survival itself. The swamp was quiet, almost respectful, as dawn slowly moved through the mist-covered cypress trees. Jeremiah and Malachi Johnson had survived 13 hunters, determined men armed with rifles and knives, men who had come carrying nothing but death in their hearts. Now the swamp, which had claimed their pursuers, seemed to pause, as if recognizing the mastery the brothers had achieved. Every step they took was slow and careful, tuned to the subtle movements of water, mud, and roots beneath their feet. They had learned since childhood that the land itself could become a weapon. And now, after days of pursuit, the lesson was complete. People they did not celebrate. Survival required caution, and there was still a long road ahead before they could reach real safety. Hunger gnawed at them, exhaustion weighed on them, and the constant tension had marked their bodies. But the swamp had given them more than protection. It had given them knowledge. Every hidden channel, every concealed mud pocket, every underwater path was carved into their memory, a network of natural traps and routes that no ordinary man could travel. As they moved through the misty waterways, the brothers thought about the hunters' arrogance. 13 men, confident in their numbers and weapons, had believed they could crush 2 brothers with nothing but brute strength. They had underestimated not only the Johnsons, but the swamp itself. The land was alive, patient, and clever, and the brothers had learned to use it with precision. Every mistake the hunters made had led to their own downfall. Yet the brothers knew this victory was not only a lesson for their pursuers, it was also a lesson for themselves. Knowledge and patience could be as deadly as any weapon. By late morning they reached an area of higher ground. The swamp thinned a little here, showing patches of dry earth and thick underbrush. Jeremiah studied the area, noticing every possible danger and opportunity. Malachi pointed toward a narrow stream that flowed deeper into the swamp, a hidden path that could serve as both an escape route and a trap if needed. They followed it slowly, aware that the hunters, if any survived, might regroup and return with more men. But the brothers were no longer afraid. They had become part of the swamp, masters of its hidden paths and silent dangers. The day stretched long, sunlight filtering through fog and mist, painting the water with lines of gold and gray. Jeremiah and Malachi moved quietly, testing each step. Listen, G to every sound. The swamp murmured around them, frogs croaking, insects buzzing, water gently touching the cypress knees. It was alive, aware, protective. They had learned to read its signs, to sense its quiet warnings, and to use its hidden strength to their advantage. Every movement was careful, every choice measured. They were no longer simply surviving. They were controlling the battlefield, the swamp itself, and the fate of anyone who dared to chase them. As evening came closer, the brothers paused on a small rise, overlooking a wide stretch of swamp. From there they could see the channels they had crossed, the hidden mud pockets that had trapped the hunters, the fallen logs, and routes that had been moved to mislead anyone following them. The size of their journey, the cleverness of their traps, and the accuracy of their actions became clear. They had not just survived, they had created a masterful defense, using intelligence and patience to turn the hunters into prey. The swamp had been their shield, but they had been their shield. But they had been its guiding hand, directing its power with care and precision. Night arrived, and the fog grew thicker. The brothers rested beneath the roots of an ancient cypress tree, listening to the soft breathing of the swamp. They had survived not through brute strength, but through intelligence, observation, and deep respect for the land. The hunters would not return for them that night, and maybe not ever again. 13 men had arrived to kill, to dominate, to force their arrogance on others, and 13 men had been humbled, shattered, and defeated. The swamp had been their judge, and the Johnson brothers, its defenders, its guides, its masters. Jeremiah spoke quietly. breaking the long silence. We've done more than just survive. We've shown what patience and knowledge can truly achieve. Malachi nodded slowly, his eyes watching the dark water. They will never understand. They will never realize that the swamp, patient and alive, was their greatest enemy, and we, through patience, observation, and skill, became unstoppable. The brothers allowed themselves a rare moment to think, understanding that survival was not only about instinct, but also about strategy, planning, and deep awareness. By the next morning, they moved again, further into the swamp, using secret channels to avoid any possible reinforcements. They were soaked, tired, and hungry, yet there was a quiet victory in their footsteps. They had survived an impossible trial, turned the hunters into the hunted, and crossed a landscape that could have killed them in many ways. The swamp had been a weapon, yes, but the brothers had been the mind guiding it. Intelligence, patience, and clever thinking had defeated brute force and arrogance. As they traveled, they thought about the deeper truth of their experience. The swamp, the land, and every obstacle they faced had become a teacher. To survive, a person needed more than strength. One needed observation, respect, patience, and strategy. The hunters had depended on weapons, numbers, and confidence, but they had failed because they underestimated both the brothers and the land itself. And the Johnson brothers had come out not only alive, but wiser, stronger, and deeply connected to the swamp that had sheltered and protected them. By late afternoon, they stepped onto a slightly higher and more open stretch of ground. The sun pushed through the mist in long golden rays, lighting the water and trees. The swamp had been a battlefield, a teacher, and a weapon. The Johnson brothers had survived, their courage and intelligence proving stronger than brute strength or blind arrogance. They stopped for a moment to catch their breath, enjoying the quiet victory of survival. Every step they had taken, every trap they had prepped, erred. Every observation they had made had led to this moment. The hunters were defeated. The swamp was their ally. And the Johnson brothers were free, at least for now. Jeremiah turned to Malachi with a faint smile. "We made it," he said softly. Malachi nodded. "For now, yes. But the lesson remains. Never underestimate the land. Never underestimate patience. Never underestimate intelligence. The swamp will protect those who understand it and punish those who do not." The brothers moved slowly ahead, leaving behind a trail that would confuse anyone who might try to follow them later. They were alive, victorious, and fully aware of the power of strategy, observation, and respect for the world around them. As darkness slowly returned, they settled beneath the roots of the cypress trees, thinking about the journey that had brought them there. 13 hunters had come with violence and arrogance. That brought them there. 13 hunters had come with violence and arrogance, but they had been defeated not by weapons or brute strength, but by intelligence, patience, and a deep understanding of the swamp. The brothers had become masters of their surroundings, and the swamp had become both a weapon and a teacher. They understood now that survival required respect, awareness, and clever thinking. The swamp had guided them, protected them, and revealed an important truth. Knowledge and patience were the most dangerous weapons of all. The Johnson brothers would continue moving deeper towards safety, always alert, always patient, always aware of the hidden power of the land. 13 men had come to hunt them, and 13 men had been humbled, defeated, and broken. The swamp had spoken, and the Johnson brothers had listened. If you have been fascinated by this powerful story of survival, intelligence, and mastery over nature, make sure to subscribe to History of Forgotten Souls and press the like button. Share your thoughts in the comments and tell us where you are watching from, your city, your country, and even your local time. We bring you forgotten stories, hidden histories, and lessons from the past that most people never discover. Stay with us, because the next story is waiting, and it is even more unbelievable than this one.